Hey, welcome to this episode of the iDeas podcast. With me is Katie. Katie, thank you so much for joining me on the first episode of Series 2.
I love being the first person of your next series. I love it.
Clearly you didn't listen to the first series well enough, so let's dive in. So, Katie, I think you've got a bit of an interesting kind of story and route into L&D, which I'm really interested to kind of dive into. But we met, really relatively recently on LinkedIn. Which has been, to be honest, how I've met most of the people that have appeared on this podcast. It's been fantastic hearing different people coming into L&D in different ways. And in just a second, I will hand over to yourself to introduce yourself properly. But first things first, the reason people tuned in Series 1, and I don't think it will change for Season 2, what are you drinking during today's chat?
I am drinking a good old straight up mango black tea. As far as I'm concerned, black tea is the superior tea.
Okay.
I know it's controversial, but that's a hill I'm willing to die on.
Fair enough. Well, here in the UK, it is uncharacteristically boiling hot. And so the idea of a cup of tea made me feel physically sick. So instead, I have gone for a now mostly empty glass of lemonade. Which is very dull to kick the season off. But I have actually run out of beer despite it only being Tuesday, which is not a great sign. So, to clarify, I didn't buy any. That's why I've run out. Calm down, clients. Your work is getting done. It's okay. So, let's dive in. I said I'd let you introduce yourself, so I will shut up and hand over to you.
All right. Well, my name is Katie Del Bagno, and I am currently, like you said, in the middle of a very bizarre Hans Christian Andersen-esque journey. Like, the way it started is clearly not the way it's going, but am hoping for a fairly fairy tale-esque ending. So I ended up originally wanting to get into higher ed, right? Started teaching. And what I went to grad school for, while I loved the material I was learning, realized fairly quickly that I did not want to be a full-time tenured professor. Like, that just wasn't my cup of tea. I liked being in the classroom, but I wasn't necessarily drawn to any of the other department or college university service. Like, I just wanted to be in the classroom one-on-one with the students. And so when I ended up moving back home, I ran into a very difficult issue because I didn't have an established network here from where I went to school. And so opted into a temp agency, found a job in corporate America in a finance department of a multi-million-dollar CPG retailer, which is a far cry from what I went to school for, but continued teaching on the side as an adjunct professor. And so I've been teaching public speaking for, I want to say this is year 7.
Oh.
And so over the summer, I kind of decided that I had a fairly easy transition into COVID teaching. Pre-COVID, I had already started moving into a hybrid model where all of the course material was online and they were only coming in person to do their speeches. So
Awesome.
When pandemic happened, the only thing that changed was their speech nights were now on Zoom as opposed to in person. And then you go through a full year of COVID teaching and really noticing a lot of the struggles that students were having, but they kind of popped up at different times over the course of the semesters. And so this summer, I kind of sat back down with myself and was like, how do we make this more applicable? How do we make it less scary? How do we, move it away from the traditional discussion board posts, turn in your assignments, right? Like, I started finding that the activities that were in an in-person setting, that I found a way to actually implement in an online format, which is a lot trickier to do because I play a lot of games. I do a lot of highly interactive stuff. Those were the things during COVID that students would gravitate to and just like white knuckle. They're like, can we please have more of this? And so this summer I sat down, I was like, how do I actually give them more of that? And in the process of reconfiguring my units, how I teach it, how I engage them and interact with them, realized that not only were they taking public speaking, but they were starting to get these learning and development-esque type trainings or resources that you would find in corporate America. So that's kind of how we got here.
It's really interesting. And when we were speaking about this kind of originally, I kind of realized that I've not really heard it put that way.
Yeah.
But I think more and more, as you say, is that kind of drift away from, oh, don't worry, we'll get back to the classroom soon. Mm. I think there's a dawning realization of it's never going to quite be like that again. People have discovered these things and they're going, actually, I quite like this. It's quite convenient not to have to be located in a certain place. I think I've kind of spoken to people on both ends of that. Some, like yourself, who have adjusted to it and adapted and found a way of moving forwards, and others who are still really struggling to make that shift from, well, I do Zoom, is that not enough? And everyone laughs, but then you go, oh, actually, it's quite prevalent. Which is really tricky. But I guess it would be interesting to hear how, for you, what was that process like? So obviously your students, it would have been an adjustment, but for you as the person creating and delivering that, what was that adjustment actually like?
Well, it's funny to look back on it. Hindsight's 2020. We had already started transitioning. So my department chair at the college is very much a data hound, right? He's constantly in the enrollment data, looking for trends, looking to see what students want and where they're technically voting with their dollars, right? And so I had been a night class, traditionally 7 to 10 p.m. And so before COVID, he actually approached me and was like, look, enrollment for night classes is dropping because the students who would normally enroll in night classes now want a hybrid version of it. So then I went through the LMS training to get certified. And so I had already been teaching a hybrid model through the LMS for a semester and a half before COVID.
Brilliant.
So we had already started that transition of rolling everything from in-person to online, which is a huge shift. And then, then you have to go through the very painful process of things that you love doing in class that you just physically cannot do through an LMS because there are certain conversations or certain discussions that have to be facilitated in real time. So that's kind of, that process had already started. Then COVID happened and students were really, really struggling, right? Navigating being full-time online, which I think was a very hard reality for a lot of students. They just figured it's like in person, but online, and not realizing how much more time, effort, and energy, but also disciplined you have to be. And then when you add in, everybody's trying to teach according to best practices. Now, all of a sudden, they're still enrolled in 4 or 5 classes, but now each class has 4 or 5 assignments due a week. So now, in addition to pandemic and potentially whatever's going on at home, now they have 20 assignments due a week, which is wild in any context. I don't like just outside of pandemic.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that's been a struggle for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But obviously from a student side, it's a workload issue. But from a teaching side, I think there's almost this myth around, well, if you've been a teacher, you practically are an instructional designer. It's the same thing. And you think, it can be, but then that's how you end up with 20 assignments a week, for instance, because the same best practice is no longer best practice.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's got to be a bit like the kind of ground shifting beneath your feet, kind of, especially when it's not a choice. When something like COVID comes along and goes, well, this is happening, get on board. Or fall over, as it were. Yeah, it's a heck of a thing. So, I mean, in that respect, I mean, it'd be interesting because I get very little kind of sight of the kind of higher ed world from working outside of it. It's kind of, certainly in the UK, it's kind of the inner workings are a shrouded mystery. We just know that the bills keep going up, and it's no longer free. So, I mean, how have you kind of seen that adjustment happen? Are people still adjusting, or is it kind of as good as it's going to get, as it were?
I think, like in most professional contexts, those who are really committed to their craft for the right reasons are always going to find ways to learn something new, implement something new, make it more accessible, make it more interesting, make it more engaging, right? Because the thing that's driving you is bettering the skills of the people taking your class. Yeah. For those who maybe are lacking engagement themselves, it's just kind of like, we're going to cruise right through this. It is what it is. Here's a format that has worked in the past. Because I would argue that pre-pandemic, being in an LMS where you do discussion board posts and submit assignments, and that's kind of the base template.
Yeah.
There are those who are like, I'm just committing to that because I'm tapped out as the instructor and I just can't. I had the privilege of only teaching a handful of classes a semester because I was working simultaneously in corporate America. So when your student load is a little bit lighter, there's a little bit more flexibility, I think, in how do I tweak this? How do I do that? Because I'm not grading at the same capacity as my peers who are full-time, at 5 classes with 32 students apiece.
That'll do it.
Right?
I think it's absolutely a struggle, isn't it? It's the kind, and that's why I kind of get the, to me, it's where the biggest gap is between the world of kind of corporate L&D, for want of a better term, and higher education, is that the split in what you're actually spending your time doing.
Yeah.
The role in corporate L&D of delivering is pretty much your job, whether it's digital, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's design. Data is going to be handled by your data intelligence department, and they're going to give that to you in a nice format that's usually visualized, or you can answer specific questions with. Lecturers and teachers, not so much. It seems to be more of a grade it, and that's your data, figure it out from there kind of thing.
Well, and I think another difference too is that in corporate L&D, it's tied to the workplace, right? So hopefully, if you're doing your job right, your students aren't ever asking, well, when am I ever going to use this? Right?
Absolutely.
Whereas in higher ed, you're learning very specific things because you have specific requirements you have to meet to graduate, right? And public speaking, for the most part in the United States, is required to graduate with your bachelor's. Like,
really?
Not
wow.
Some states have made it optional, but for the most part, it is a required class. Now, whether you do it at a community college and then you don't have to when you transfer to a university, or if you just go straight to university, at some point in those 4 years, you do have to take a public speaking class. And for most students, it's not a fun class. Right, where most students will walk into anthropology being like, oh, I'll learn something cool this semester, even if I never use it. But when they walk into my classroom, like, you can cut the tension with a knife on day one, right?
Yeah.
For the most part, everyone's very nervous. Nobody knows how it's going to go. And it's something that people just genuinely are uncomfortable with. And then you have to find a way to make it fun, and then make it applicable where they can leave your classroom or finish the module and go, okay, I can immediately apply this tomorrow. So for me, like, there's a lot of contextualization that has to happen, where you have to very almost unapologetically be like, all right, here's how you take what we're learning and use it at work tomorrow. Like, here's how that happens.
That's interesting, because this wasn't on the notes for things we were going to discuss, but this is really well timed, because literally, it was either yesterday or over the weekend, I had a conversation with a few people on LinkedIn and then on Facebook about engagement in L&D. and how engagement really shouldn't be a measure of it's fun or it's colourful or it's it's got a game in it. Engagement should be really, and certainly in workplace L&D, gained through applicability.
Yeah.
I should be engaged because I can see the value in this learning experience. Because otherwise you're left with, well, how do you make a CPR class fun?
Right.
Chances are whatever you're thinking is wildly inappropriate.
Yeah.
That is it's an immediately useful skill. That should be the engagement point of it. And that's what's going to lead to your increased retention and all that kind of thing. But it's really interesting to hear you say that in the higher ed world, because certainly for me, I loved slightly different setup in the UK, but I loved school, I loved college, and utterly despised, and continue to do so, every higher education experience I have, because it's completely unapplicable. There's no context to anything.
Yeah.
It's interesting to discuss philosophical truth, as people like to tell me it is. And it's cool, but I can't engage with it.
Yeah.
Because they're going, I'm not going to use this ever.
Yeah.
And everyone kind of goes, well, we know that, but you just have to do it.
Yeah.
It's like, this could be why people aren't signing up to your course.
Yeah.
That's so that's so interesting to that you're bringing that over. So, I mean, with something like public speaking, how do you do that? Because I would assume most of the people in your course are probably not envisaging a career as a public speaker.
Yeah, that's 100% true. It actually started, I think, very innocently. Like it wasn't an intentional choice at the very beginning. So teaching at a community college, a lot of my students are either fresh out of high school or they're returning back to a more affordable model to upskill so that they can hopefully climb the ladder at work. And by teaching night classes, I am inherently exposed to students who are in more difficult situations than the kid who can go to school from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? Like nobody takes a night class for fun. You are there for a reason. Right? Am I wrong?
Yeah, nice. Sure, it's funny. It's just because of the way we think of them. Night classes in the UK, broadly speaking, are taken as enjoyment classes.
Oh, that's pretty funny. That is not how it works here.
Yeah, no, by the sounds of it, it's quite. But similarly here, they aren't usually attached to degrees and stuff. Night classes here tend to be your kind of like, I'm going to learn pottery of an evening every Tuesday for 6 months or whatever. But yeah, I get where that difference is. That's quite interesting in of itself, actually.
So a lot of my students either had 2 part-time jobs or they had a full-time job, and they were coming to school at night. And then teaching in Southern California, which has a very diverse population, I also had a lot of students who were in minorities, like in a wide variety of them. And so, you chat with them before class, you find ways to engage them during class, and you start hearing their stories, you start hearing about the things they're going through. But every time I would teach a new concept and I would allude to, like you can use this at work, I was always met with, I work part-time as a barista, or I work, part-time in retail. I don't get to make presentations. What I have to say doesn't really matter because I'm at the bottom of the org chart. And so you start hearing the little snippets. Again, they sneak out. It's not like you have a full-blown conversation, but you start hearing little snippets of, that's not for me. I can't do that. I'll never be in a position where I have power or authority, or I'm here because 10 years from now, one day I'll be a manager. And that, when you hear it over and over and over and over again, just as side comments, you're like, okay, this is something we're gonna work to address. If I can find a way to show you can use this skill now, regardless of where you are in the org chart, regardless of whether or not you're a temp, regardless of whether or not you're part-time, these are the little skills you can use to become a leader in your organization or to climb the ladder. So it actually started with my impromptu unit. Like that was the first place I immediately put it in. Because again, impromptu speaking is scary. Nobody likes having a limited amount of time to come up with presentation. So while I can't necessarily change the speech they're required to give for that unit because it's a departmental standard, what I started doing was putting one activity a class period or one activity a module, where it was what the skills they were learning from the textbook, from all the, the required stuff. Now I want you to use that, but I want you to think about it in terms of a job interview. I want you to think about it in terms of talking with your boss about a promotion or a raise, right? Because normally these conversations, well, if it's a job interview, that's very straightforward, right? Like you obviously have a limited amount of time to prepare your answers for the questions that you're being asked. But when you're having a conversation about a promotion or a raise, sometimes those conversations happen as, like it started from somewhere else and it just kind of took that turn. Or sometimes you initiate that conversation and it doesn't go the way you planned. And now you have to start bringing them back and making your argument for it. And so I've always had very high engagement with those activities, right? Students immediately pick up on it and they're like, yeah, this is something I need to know. And they start working harder on probably one of the scariest units because they can directly see, if I master this, I can be better in a job interview. I can get a better job. And so this summer is really when I sat down, I was like, okay, how do I take the way I contextualize the impromptu unit and do the same thing for the informative and the persuasive units? So, and this semester is where we're test piloting it.
Awesome. But that's so good to hear. Because I think there's certainly here, whenever I speak to people about it, which isn't that often, but whenever I do, there seems to be a fear about changing like a course that's been the same for 20 years or whatever. Mm-hmm. I inherited it from the person before me and they inherited it from the person before them, and we know it meets all the standards, so best not change it. Right. And with everything that's gone on now, it's a case of, well, we don't have to change it, we just have to do it on Zoom. You're like, okay, right, I get what you mean, but whereas what you're describing is far more like the kind of approach you would take in workplace L&D. Where you are kind of adjusting according to what the actual people need is. Yeah. More so than just worrying about ticking the requirement boxes. Yeah. And looking a bit more about the long-term impact as opposed to just, can you get, quote unquote, get through the course? So I'd be really interested to hear, I know obviously you're test piloting at the minute. What are kind of your initial observations in terms of how people are actually responding to that? Is it good, bad, indifferent? Hopefully it's not bad. If it is, we'll cut this part.
Well, I'm actually teaching late start classes, so it literally started today. So.
Oh, okay. So how's it going? Surely you know by now.
Good. It's going great right now. I haven't had any complaints.
Excellent. No, but in which case it would be really interesting to hear kind of further down the line how that goes, because it's such a refreshing approach to hear. And one thing that I think is interesting is, I would imagine from their perspective, your course is going to mirror much more what they're going to see further in life when they go into workplaces that provide workplace training.
Hopefully.
Because certainly at the minute, I know, before I moved into instructional design and came out to work for myself, I worked in businesses where we would get people fresh out of education of whatever type it was, and they would all sort of go, wow, it's so different learning here versus learning in education. Yep. And they really struggled with that difference, more so than you might expect. So it'd be really interesting to see if that has an impact. Obviously, that's a very long term, interesting to see. Come back in 10 years and then we'll see what's going on.
Maybe you just need to have me on season 3 and then...
There we go. There we go. You can become a permanent fixture. First episode of every season will get an update on where your current set of test students are.
Yeah, you have me on next season and then potentially I'll have beta tested it twice.
There we go. Brilliant. Yeah. So one thing I'd really like to ask about, based on everything you've said, in terms of your approach to actually redesigning it so it isn't just we'll use Zoom as the solution for everything. What kind of solutions have you actually, or are you actually going to sort of employ with it?
So right now, it's tricky because something that's very common in the US with online education is that you typically do one module a week and you give them 7 days to do it. So it unlocks Monday, they have till Sunday at midnight to turn it in. And with that, students tend to come up with their own rhythm, right? When they do work, how they do work, which makes it really challenging for you as the person facilitating the course. Because if you have a student who's logging in 3 days a week versus one student who's logging in at 10 o'clock on Sunday, it's very difficult because not everybody's in the same place at the same time. And you don't want to mandate, because I do teach asynchronous classes. So while they do meet on Zoom for their speech nights, I afford them a lot of autonomy the rest of the semester because I recognize that if you're working 2 jobs, your schedule is going to be hectic, and I can't mandate specific times for people, especially after the class has been advertised as asynchronous. So finding different ways and playing around with the LMS platform to see what it can afford. One thing that I've been looking into a little bit more is doing real-time like polling, which the LMS we use doesn't have. Like you have to use an exterior widget and make sure it's compatible. But doing real-time polling, I've implemented 7-TAPS courses into my modules as a way to teach really dense information. Like because typically, again, if it's a dense piece of information, you're breaking out in chunks anyway. So mixing up, here's content reading with a 7-TAPS course. Here's a little bit more reading with a 7-TAPS course, and you change the way they're engaging with it. One of the things I would really like, and I need to make sure our LMS can support it, but I wanted to use articulate storyline to make an escape room as a way of teaching logical fallacies for persuasion. And having the logical fallacies be the clues in the escape room. So you have to know what all of them are in order to recognize them. Doing that, I want to have one of my most popular assignments, and it was popular pre-COVID, it's even more popular during COVID, is I do a Walking Dead version for persuasive appeals. So you're given a narrative, you're given a list of people with very specific professions and a list of very specific shops. And you have to choose 3 people and 3 shops to get your supplies in order to survive the next 30 days. And so they have to they have to make the best argument for why their 3 people and their 3 shops are going to keep them alive for 30 days. And so that's always a crowd favorite. They love it. And this semester, I want to introduce that same activity, but do it March Madness style. So now your arguments are bracketed and you go head to head until there is one remaining argument that is the undefeated champion.
That's brilliant. And this has long been the discussion of, well, you can only make higher education so much fun. Right. Where was this?
Right.
That's But I'm fairly confident if I showed. So I ended up sort of working on my degree part-time, remotely, and fully online.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I'd have shown them Articulate Storyline, everyone in the building would have had a heart attack. They wouldn't have thought that was technically possible.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean we can have a next button on a slideshow? They wouldn't have like accepted that it existed.
Yeah.
It's madness. But I feel like this is, especially if it's a course that where you say people are inherently nervous about it,
Mm-hmm.
it's such a wonderful way to bring it to life. And, you know, we were talking about engagement through relevance, but then already having that and then putting this on top is really going to help let people sort of remember this. It's really going to stick. Certainly a walk. I love the idea of the Walking Dead one. That's fantastic. But it is great to hear that, you know, that these things are going into the world beyond, as I say, just Zoom. I'm not gonna lie, I've been thoroughly disappointed now. I feel we need to move. Right. That's so yeah. I mean, that's. Again, it's difficult because I haven't launched it. I want to ask how it's gone and what the differences are. And we're definitely going to have to come back.
Well, for me...
So, go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, so for me, again, like, I think the content you teach really dictates how you choose to approach it. For me, because I know public speaking is something that all of my students are, to some degree, very nervous and hesitant towards, I find ways to make it fun and engaging as a way to reduce the fear, right? Like, you have to be able to pull them off the ceiling in order to get them to pay attention and really understand it. But then finding ways to implement it, like the cardinal rule for learning is that your learners have to be able to make an immediate connection. Otherwise, they're never going to retain it, right? So pre-COVID, I was doing a lot to contextualize it in everyday experiences, right? Conversations you have with your friends, your family. When we start talking about persuasion, I usually use Thanksgiving as a way, right? Because in the United States, Thanksgiving is known. Like, there's something about turkey and gravy that just like brings out the worst in people. And there are a lot of arguments, whether they're usually political, because it's right around some election season, right? And you're just, it's something in the United States, like, we laugh about it, right? Like, Thanksgiving, usually you have a relative that says something, that sparks something, that does something that, and so that's the way I would kind of introduce it. And what's normally, I don't get to see my students after the semester, but the other year I did have a student who took a medical incomplete because she ended up needing emergency surgery. So her last class that she attended was when we talked about Thanksgiving dinner. And then because she had a medical incomplete, she got to make up the remainder of the course the following semester in the spring. And so when I was talking to her, she was telling me, she's like, oh my gosh, you're so right. And everything you pointed out happened. And she goes, and then I was the one who saved the day because I could see it and I could bring people and you know, recontextualize it and explain misunderstandings. And she goes, people were still mad, but at least they stopped yelling.
And yeah, that's almost like the best possible advert for it, right? You kind of go, right, now say that to this camera so that we can show this to everyone who attends the course.
Yeah, so now it's, you know, I think especially with COVID and students really wanting something to like grasp onto. This morning, I had a couple of students who messaged me telling me they were excited about the course because their first assignment is really fun. And it was just like that immediate, like, oh, like right out the gate, like it's not just here's the syllabus, here's the material, but in that first module, again, right out the gate, there's a 7 taps deck that they go through to learn about communication apprehension, what it is, what you're going to feel, what you might be thinking. Here's a survival guide for it. And then they get to make their own survival guides using whatever media they want. If they want to do TikToks, if they want to put together a YouTube playlist, if they want to make it visual, like whatever it is, here are the requirements. you make your survival guide, you're going to share it with your peers. So that way now we're sharing resources about how we don't pass out, I guess is the easiest way to put that.
Yeah, no.
But then,
I was just going to say it's interesting because there's always a discussion around if you give people those kind of social discussion kind of type of things to do as part of a course, will they go and do them? And often, in my experience, certainly in the corporate world, I get that argument a lot from face-to-face facilitators who say you can absolutely only do that in the room. Doing it socially and online doesn't work. No one will do it. Clearly not the experience you're having.
I think it depends. Like, you can find it. I feel like as long as you're respectful of the limitations you have to work within, right? My students typically are balancing multiple jobs, a full-time job with their education. Sometimes they're balancing a part-time job and having to help pay bills. Like, I feel like as long as you're respectful of what you already know is coming to the table and trying to be mindful of their limitations, I don't know that do exist in this class because somebody hasn't shared them with me. You can still find ways to engage them. And I try to think about it in terms of like, if the student I am trying to reach only has time to log in on a Sunday from 7 to 11 p.m., if that's literally all they can give to this class, how can I build an engaging course regardless of how much time somebody has to give?
That's a brilliant approach.
How do I do that? And once you're respectful of those limitations, it forces you to not only get creative, but it forces you to be very innovative. And the more creative and innovative you are, they tend to match the energy you bring. And this is something any facilitator will tell you, right? You set the tone for the room. If you walk into the room and you feel tension and you buckle to it, it's going to be an awful, awful course. But if you walk into a room and you feel tension, it is your obligation to reset the tone and they'll match it. Right? It's part of the reason why I played so many games when I was teaching in person was because they're there from 7 to 10 o'clock at night. It's late. They're tired. They're hungry. And they're not going to want me lecturing at them any more than I want to lecture at them for 3 hours. Right?
Yeah.
So if you set this energy of like, it's fun, it's engaging, regardless of whether you can give me an hour 3 days a week or 3 hours 1 day a week, they'll match it.
I think that's such a good approach, and then just giving them that freedom to decide how to complete things. I love the fact that you said they have the option of coming back with really whatever they want to, as long as it meets the kind of requirements for what you've asked for. That's such a brilliant approach.
Well,
rather than the standard fill this out and send it back.
Yeah.
Which is so often still the case.
Well, originally what I'd been doing was, in the first kind of year of COVID teaching, they were submitting assignments, but it was up to them it was like, you can write it paragraph form, you can do it bullet point, you can do it in a chart, but here's what the LMS will support. And then over this past summer, I went to a webinar that had to do with diversity and inclusion on all spectrums. And so one of the women who was speaking was autistic, and she had one other disability, and I don't quite remember what it was. But she was talking about how she was so frustrated going through school, particularly higher ed, where everything had to be a paper. And she was like, I can't focus long enough. She goes, I can tell you. She goes, if you want me to talk for 10 minutes, I can talk for 10 minutes, but I can't physically sit down and write a 3-page paper. And she said, so I got bad grades, not because I wasn't smart, not because I wasn't capable, but because I had limitations where I couldn't meet the format that was or the very rigid format that was expected of me. And so it got me thinking, where typically in higher ed, I feel like a very common approach is you kind of set your course, and then as students bring you their access papers, which so they go to the disability office, they do the testing, and then they get their requirements kind of put out for you. And then they bring that to you, and then you adapt the course for them based on their access requirements. Yeah. It got me thinking, where I was like, well, what if there's somebody who maybe hasn't gone to access, or figures that limitations that they have are just because like it's them as a person, not something that they need to go to access for, right? Like, or maybe a student doesn't want to because they don't want to be treated differently, right? So I don't want to get paperwork. I don't want to be documented as being quote unquote different. So it got me thinking about, like, okay, so I'm building a course based on what I know works in person, what people are drawn to. And then I'm setting it based on kind of like my preference for receiving it. But then after going to this disability course, I was like, well, yeah, what if somebody just wanted to record themselves talking for 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Right? If you're going to talk to me for 2 to 3 minutes, that's roughly 250 words, which is a minimum requirement for a discussion board post. So why don't I just give you the option? What if you're somebody who is very artistic or very visual, and you want to find a different way to express what I'm asking you to tell me? Okay, cool. Like, so you figure out what the LMS can actually support, and then you just give them the freedom. Because again, if you're allowing them to get creative and innovative, they're going to put more time and effort into it because they're excited about the work. But also in the workplace, if you're given a challenge, the more creative and innovative you are with a solution, the better the result is anyway. So why not give you this freedom to be creative and innovative in the work you're submitting? Because that's just drilling down that skill set. It becomes second nature almost, as opposed to being given permission. You just inherently start problem solving from a more creative and innovative space.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that struck me then is the amount of time, certainly the amount of requests I get for training on creative problem solving, being innovative, because people have had it absolutely drummed out of them. Yeah. Whether it's through education or the early stages of their career, where it's important that everything you do in this format, because that's the only thing that's acceptable. And now we're almost seeing workplaces going, why is no one innovative? It's like, it's your fault. Yeah. It'll be so interesting again to see if more places engaged in this, would we see a workforce that was just inherently creative in solving problems rather than having to be trained, which is a hugely uphill battle, as we all know. Once you've stopped being creative, getting back to it. When I'd sometimes always say, does training really impact this? Is this not if your culture does not inherently promote it, doesn't matter what we train kind of situation? Yeah, but I can't say that because people pay me not to. But yeah, so it's almost like they are picking up another skill set, quote unquote, for free within this course, which is really it'd be an interesting approach to see more people pick up on. Hint, hint. Yeah. If you're listening to this, do it. So I thought it'd be so many different things I want to ask about now. But I guess probably the biggest thing would be in terms of people, kind of the overall topic I said we were going to talk about, which was them coming into contact with L&D earlier in their kind of career or education / career, depending on where they are. How are you seeing that happen, I guess, is the biggest question. How are they kind of going, oh, this is L&D as opposed to education, and what difference is that actually making?
I think, again, it really depends, right? So you have, like in higher education, you are kind of bound by departmental standards that you have to operate within, right? Because it is education. You need to make sure that regardless of who's taking your class, Like they're still learning the same as people, other teachers in the department, right? Yeah. And so while I'm tied to public speaking, right, as opposed to interpersonal communication, which is one-on-one, while the majority of what they're learning is in the context of you standing or sitting in front of a group of people talking about prepared material, the way that I'm refining those skill sets has to do within a workplace setting. So for example, like with my informative unit, right, the majority of the work that they're doing is tied to public speaking for an informative type setting. But then they'll have, probably it'll be one discussion or activity in the module that gets them to look at how you're sharing information with others in a workplace setting and looking at it in terms of leadership, regardless of where you are on the org chart, right? I think there are a lot of us who have had at least one instance in our careers where we can think of somebody who had a very prominent title in our organization, but was not regarded as a leader, right? And everybody,
many of them,
right? And everybody has had that one or two people in their career who was either towards the bottom or the middle of the org chart that everybody goes to for help because they know so much, right? So it's recontextualizing that, yeah, if you're in an organizational setting and you're giving a speech, cool, here's how you do it. If you're not, how are you sharing information with one another? Because you may not necessarily be citing specific sources, but you're usually giving credit to the person who taught you, right? How are you framing this information so it's easy to understand, easy to digest, right? And then with the persuasive unit, recontextualizing it in terms of miscommunication in the workplace. Like I'm someone who very staunchly believes that the majority of conflict you see in a workplace stems from misunderstanding, just the same as an incredibly long meeting stems from a lot of miscommunication happening in that meeting. And so while meetings are typically solutions driven, right? You're there to either share information or more specifically solve a problem.
They certainly should be.
But using, like, here's how persuasive theory fits into this. Here's how you identify where the miscommunication is happening. Here's how you structure it. Here's how you stack what you're sharing. So that way you're not only being heard as opposed to being railroaded and talked over, but if you can understand, where in, for example, the propositions, right? Fact, value, and policy. If everybody is here, you can't argue solutions yet. You have to get them to agree on something and then agree that it has value before you can even start talking about how to fix it. And if maybe somebody at the bottom of the org chart is in the meeting and you see that disconnect and you can identify it, articulate it to them, and then walk them through that, like facilitate that discussion so you're moving one at a time, right? Now people are starting to recognize you. They're starting to take your idea, like listen to what you're saying. And just because you're at the bottom or the middle of the org chart doesn't mean your ideas don't have value, right? So using that as the way to contextualize it for them. And then again, keeping the impromptu unit the same, right? Job interviews, promotions, raises.
Yeah, it's weird. It's a really interesting approach to hear. And I think it's not because I don't think many people are going to hear it and go, no one's ever done this before. It's completely new. But it's just, you wonder, why has this not been applied before now? It's not as if we've, in the last kind of 2 years, gone, we have fundamentally changed our understanding of how people learn or how this works. It feels like, more than anything, it feels like there's been a push and organizations have had to let people do things in a different way. And because they didn't have the answer themselves, people like yourself have been given a bit more freedom and been allowed to go, make changes, do what you want. And I think I hope anyway, that we see a lot more of what you've done.
I hope so too.
This is it, and I think there are glimmers of hope. The more conversations I have, the more I think, okay, people are taking that opportunity and running with it.
Yeah.
Whereas in the first 6 months, everyone just seemed to be denying that anything had to change, which was a bit worrying initially.
It was.
So, yeah, that's. I swear, most people are a lot more diplomatic than me, whereas I went around going, "What are you doing?
Yeah.
This is the best opportunity you will ever have. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but to affect change, now is the time," kind of thing. If you're going to try something new, do it. You're not going to get permission to do it again once everything calms down. It's so it's great to see it happening. So I'm really interested for you as a professional in the world of L&D and education. What's kind of on your radar? What are you looking at over the next kind of year?
I think one of the things that's obviously going to take most of my focus is fine-tuning this like new structure for the way I'm teaching. I've got a rough idea of what I want to do, and as the weeks go on, you kind of refine it and put it down. But I personally would like to see more organizations really invest in finding ways to meet their employees where they're at and propelling them forward. I think a lot of what I've been seeing in terms of like what people are talking about on LinkedIn, what I've been hearing in conversations with the people that I know and I chat with in the L&D space, is that, like you pointed out, there's this weird disconnect between this is the way it was and it's different for right now, but like we're going to go back to it and we need to keep everything very finite so that way when we get to the quote unquote other side, it can just go back to the way it was. And people in droves are saying it wasn't really working before. Then we were given this opportunity where we didn't have to tolerate it. We don't want to go back. And so what I'm hoping for, and it's something I heard on a webinar maybe about a month or two ago, where the speaker had said, people don't fear change, they fear loss. And so while she had said that in context with more empathetic listening, meeting people where they're at, she specifically was contextualizing it with SMEs who are difficult.
No, there's no such thing. SMEs are all delightful and helpful, and I will not hear you say a bad word about them.
But I felt like that piece of advice is just so universal. And I think that there are a lot of organizations who are so afraid of profits getting worse or progress getting worse or whatever it is. They're so afraid of losing whatever momentum they felt they had before the pandemic that they're unwilling to reevaluate what people can give if you allow them the opportunity to experience or provide in a different way, right? Like it kind of goes back to what I was saying with giving my students various modalities to submit work, right? Yeah. Where if the goal truly is this specific end result and you want it to be creative and innovative, you have to allow people to think about it, process it, workshop it, brainstorm it. All of that has to be done very creatively and innovatively. And that might not necessarily be the textbook cookie cutter checkbox way that happened pre-pandemic. So that's kind of what I would love to see.
Oh, wouldn't that be a lovely world? It would be.
Yeah.
I think the thing is, it's not that difficult to do. And you see it in businesses already. Some businesses are embracing that, and others are still using terms like wastage to describe those times. Mm-hmm. So I was going to say how much, it got wastage or shrinkage. And you go, so how much shrinkage do we need to get people off the phone for training?
Mm.
And I'm kind of left thinking, well, it's not shrinkage, it's training.
Yeah.
It's not wasted time.
Mm-hmm.
This time is not being thrown in the bin. This is being invested in your people. That's not, you wouldn't describe a meeting with external financial investors as wasted time.
No.
So why is investing in your existing people who are actually going to generate money for you that doesn't charge interest or shares? But I think it is going to require quite a colossal kind of corporate mentality shift away from straight line to profit to kind of wavy line to longevity. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if some of the bigger and older businesses especially have got the bravery to do it.
The way I look at it, based on my corporate experience, is that, I think it's fairly common in corporate America, especially if you've worked in a finance department, the idea of if you're a stagnant company, you're already dying, right? Mm. Like if you are generating, let's just say 10 billion a year, and year after year, you're only at 10 billion, there's never any growth, that is the beginning of your descent. Right? $10 billion is still a lot of money. But in terms of corporate America, if you are not growing, it means you don't have brand loyalty. It means you're not selling as much. And now you're trying to find ways to cut spending in order to add to the bottom line because you're portraying a different image than what's actually happening, right? It's all about the portrayal of who you are because of your standing. But what I have found in my experience is that if you spend more time on the way you're perceived versus actually taking risk, actually putting money where your mouth is, actually investing in the people who understand at the most nuanced level, like that is the beginning of the end. And so I think that companies who are just all out, right out the gate, we're going to find a better way to do this. We're going to change. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. They're going to be the ones who survive. The ones who don't are going. Unfortunately, if you're not taking advantage of that market, if you're not finding a way to meet people where they're at, brand loyalty is going to someone else. And so I think we're verging a point in time where you can't just say you're doing something. You actually have to live it, breathe it, and exude it, because what consumers want are different. And at the end of the day, like the thing that has always been consistent is that your best advertising is word of mouth. And that starts with the people who work for you. Because while they may not be going out and standing on a street corner to tell every stranger, their friends and their family know what's going on.
Oh, yeah.
And there is nobody more loyal than your friends and family. And then that gets passed around slowly but surely. And then the public image you're portraying is a very transparent facade.
It's interesting. I think on a smaller scale, you can apply exactly that same thing down into L&D as a department. Internally, how are you seen as a business? Are you seen as a department that finds new ways of doing things, solves problems, actually does something, or are you seen as the department that talks about nonsense? Mm-hmm. And when someone asks you to demonstrate performance, you use phrases like engagement and culture and fun, or do you talk about the impact you've had on the business? Mm-hmm. Which I know is a big discussion at the moment. but let's see. Right now, I was speaking to someone earlier the week. They said, what do you do about all these L&D departments getting axed? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, my gut feeling is right now in this culture, if a business is looking at its L&D department and saying, we can do without you, it might be the L&D department's fault. because lots of other businesses are saying, now's the time to drive forwards, now's the time for change. That's where L&D should be like the shining star. Whether, I guess it's the same in education. If you're going to change a program, you need educators and educational designers to be able to make that happen. If your business is thinking we don't need those people, it could mean that you're not seen that way. And it is the start of the end for you as a department, if not as a business. It's not always the business's fault. Sometimes it's a bit of an arrow in moment.
Very true.
That's awesome. So, I mean, in terms of, we're kind of approaching the end. So I'll just ask really quickly. Right now, what are you, just as a kind of takeaway and a tip for everyone else, what are you doing to develop your skills at the moment as you forge a path forwards in creating courses?
So one of the things I've been doing is really dedicating time to articulate storyline, because I think even though it's traditionally used in a corporate setting, I see so many benefits for using it in an educational space as well. And so finding different ways to learn what it really can harness. So for example, when Devlin Peck had posted on LinkedIn his video about how you could use it to create an escape room and, walk through step by step, here's how you do it. I was like, this is a very easy way to recreate some of the in-person experiences. If you're used to playing games in an in-person setting, most people love escape rooms. Most people have done an escape room. It's very easy to get them involved, right? So really exploring a lot of the ed tech that would maybe only exist in a corporate L&D space and trying to incorporate it into higher ed. But then I'm also a sucker for webinars. So over the course of the summer, I've been doing at least 3 webinars or networking events a week, and just really hearing what's going on in the community. What are people talking about? What are people excited about? What about those things makes it exciting? And then finding a way to incorporate it into higher ed, because the students can benefit from that just as much as employees can. So why not find a way to bridge the two?
I think that's brilliant advice. I think I've long kind of felt that we're an unusual industry across kind of learning and development, from educational and from corporate world, where everyone is really quite happy to just tell each other everything about what they do. It's great though, because having come from a kind of sales and management background before L&D, no one tells anyone anything. It's all trade secrets and my special way of doing it. You read a book and you copy that, but everyone likes to think it's their own special way. Whereas L&D, you can contact anyone. They're just like, yeah, sure, let's jump on a call, or I'm part of this Slack group, or I'm on LinkedIn. I put all my work up there anyway. Have a look. There's so much to take advantage of, whether it's groups like TLDC or GLDC or any of the other DCs that have popped up all over the world. But there's communities for everything. And I think the more we can kind of pull on that, it's kind of a free and never-ending resource, which is always great. But anyway, it's been like an hour. So Katie, I really appreciate you taking the time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule with everything you've got going on, to join me for this chat. And 100% we will have to get you back next season to hear about how it's worked and what changes you are making on the fly, and whether articulate storyline makes it in there and how it goes down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. There will be links in the description of this episode on where you can get in touch and connect with Katie, assuming she wants those. If not, you'll know she's not very friendly and doesn't want to speak to any of you. Note, that's why none of my links are in the description of the episode below. Do remember, there is a whole host of episodes coming up, and this series really is about throwing the doors open to anyone and everyone in the learning world to come and share their thoughts, have a cup of tea, whether it's a new project, a new approach, a theory you want to talk about, or you just want to chat about your path into the learning world. Get in touch. Everyone is welcome.